Right.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Lindsay Parks Pieper at Elon University in North Carolina.
Prof. It's a great privilege to be talking to you, and I've already commented on the spectacular background you have. As this is only an audio file, people won't know the kinds of images that I can see behind you. But
Yeah.
let's say it's a new office that the prof has moved into. So that aside, I have my stereotypical question I pose to people, which is to inquire what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you. What's going on for the prof?
Sure. I think I'll go with preoccupying as North Carolina literally just weathered a storm. We're not used to getting several inches of snow, and we received 10 inches, and it was a beautiful snow. And so there was lots of sledding and snowball fights. I have two children, 6 and 8. And so while it was a joy to be able to experience the snow with them, they don't have a lot of memories in the snow. We don't get it all that often. The downside, and this is the preoccupied side, is that they were out of school for a week and a half. And so there were many cancellations, many closures, and we had lots of wonderful family time, but a week and a half out of school is also pretty intense. And actually, Elon was also closed as well. So we're finally just getting back into the swing of a normal routine.
Well, I'm especially grateful that you've taken time out from dodging snowballs from 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds. And did you make a snow person with a carrot for a nose or anything like that?
We made a snow bear. So we took it in a different direction. But yes, they were very excited to be able to make an animal out of snow, something they had not been able to do before.
Now, the snow bear could be pretty tall.
It could be. It was not. They got tired after about the first heaving of the snow to about 2 feet. So maybe it's a snow baby bear, I guess,
Yeah,
perhaps.
a baby bear. Lovely. Prof, sports and gender, described very roughly, are your bailiwick and where you've made amazing contributions. Now, a lot of your contributions I've read. I've not read, I live in the global South, we don't have access. Sex testing, gender policing in women's sport, your book on that topic. But I have read a number of your articles on this subject matter. And it's something that's been controversial for a century, maybe. Would I be right in saying that?
I think it depends on how you want to define sex testing. Really, since women have participated in sport, there have been controversies surrounding their participation. But yes, to say the actual policies of sex testing, our earliest ones date to about the 1930s.
Okay, so it is about a century, but it goes back to the very idea of women playing sport. Could you tell us a
Yeah,
bit about that from an
yeah,
historical
absolutely.
perspective?
And so because modern sport, as we know it, particularly in many Western or global Northern countries, um, developed as this avenue to showcase masculinity, manliness, the characteristics society typically associates with boys and men. When women started to participate, it raised a lot of questions about the characteristics that they then were demonstrating and the prowesses that they displayed. And so truly, as sport was developing and the male sport leaders were seeing girls and women compete, well, if a sport is supposed to demonstrate masculinity and manliness, well, then what does it mean when a girl or a woman is also exhibiting those characteristics? And so girls and women have challenged the boundaries of what we think of as sport for centuries and kind of led us down this path where we have sport organizers trying to then figure out, okay, if we're going to have both men's sports and women's sport, what's the dividing point and how can we verify it?
And if I think about the modern Olympics, there are sports where this isn't considered important, where women and men compete against one another. I think that's right. I mean, correct me if I've got this wrong. In rifle shooting, archery, equestrian. I don't know about other events, but where there's not a sort of even mixed doubles. It is you against me, right?
Oh, absolutely. So equestrian is an example that comes up quite frequently where you have men and women competing together, competing against one another, and
Hmm.
not in the mixed double sense where it's a quota and you have a perhaps a male and a female rider. It is very much intermingled. In fact, some of the research that I've done, you have equestrian athletes who also, because they identified as women, were forced to undergo this sex test and pointing out why are we undergoing, why do we have to do this, I'm competing against men as it is. And it's funny that you mentioned rifle shooting. It's an example that comes up where men and women historically did compete against one another. And this is a little bit outside. I don't talk about this in my work, but I know a lot of women's sport historians who point to this because it's when a woman won in the 80s is when it became segregated into men's and women's
Oh my
competition.
God, we
So I think
shouldn't
that's,
laugh, but
yeah,
good grief.
you have to laugh or else it's just too sad.
It is just too awful. One of the things, just riffing on that for a moment, you may know that in the case of football, by which I mean real football, not when men wear helmets,
Sure.
but real football, when you use your foot on the ball, it was outlawed in Britain for decades. And as in many countries, so for 50 years, women were not given access to grounds and so on. So that's getting on for 60 years ago now. There is a thriving women's pro league there, as there is in the US, although there isn't the great undergirding of football for women as there is in college sports in the United States. But there's a fair bit of money. And there's massive media interest in big events like the World Cup, but not for the everyday pro league, and there aren't massive attendances. This is constantly being explained in terms of the historical lag of legitimacy, instead of the fact that corporations aren't very interested and there isn't enough money for promotion. You know, it's as if there's just the magic of history that cannot be erased, rather than the purposive lack of action on the part of hegemonic actors, right? Anyway, that's
Mhm.
parenthetical. So back to that instance, how do they justify, when I say they, I guess I'm thinking here of the IOC, International Olympic Committee, allowing women to compete with and against men as if there were no difference in one or two areas, but not more generally? Is it to do with there being a horse or a bow and arrow, rather than it being in some, in inverted commas, pure sense, body against body?
I think that's right. For they've not been explicit. There's not a statement saying about when men and women can compete together, when there needs to be segregated competitions. For me, I often think about Eleanor Matheny to answer this question, a sport philosopher from the University of Iowa who was writing in the 60s, but she articulated a paradigm about what sports were either not acceptable or wholly acceptable, appropriate for women. And part of it had to do with the body contact, when there is contact made. And then another part has to do with when an external object is used. And so when you mentioned the horse, that there is an external, in this instance, animal, or with rifling, that there was an external object being used, that it makes it more acceptable. And so I think you can then extend that to the IOC, thinking that there's not the direct confrontation, but they're using these other factors, animal or rifle, in order to compete. So there's not a document that says here's the
Right,
sports where women
right.
and men compete together, here's where they cannot. And the line then between men's sport and women's sport that we see outside those examples, like equestrian, that's where they then, the IOC leaders were trying to establish, and it was an arbitrary line they were establishing, and then they followed up with trying to figure out a way to verify it. They drew their own line and then needed some sort of mechanism to try to uphold their arbitrary line in the
And
sand.
this way of thinking doesn't apply to sports where upper body strength is crucial, shot put, discus, javelin, where there are these other objects that mediate, but where they would be deemed to be a somatic advantage to men. But where it's about skill, pretty much more than anything else, they can sort of abide by it. It's an interesting one. So getting back to your book, as I say, I'm afraid I haven't read it, though I've read plenty of your essays. Could you take us through the book and give listeners an idea of the terrain that you traverse?
Sure, absolutely. So my book, Sex Testing, it chronicles the International Olympic Committee and then the International Association of Amateur Athletics Federation, IAAF, which I'll now though refer to as World Athletics, since that's what they have rebranded since 2019. But it covers their policies. So the World Athletics and the IOC, their gender-based policies that they introduced in elite competitions starting from the 1930s up through, and when I published it, it had been about 2011 was the most recent, which unfortunately has since shifted and changed and been re-implemented. But one of the things that my book does that was new at the time, and there are many brilliant people who are now writing about sex testing from a lot of different angles, was extend it past the Cold War. So previously, a lot of the literature had been about the introduction of compulsory sex testing in the Cold War, but I actually start in the 1930s. The earliest record I found about sex testing, an effort to verify women athletes' sex in order to compete, was from the 1928 Olympics. There's it's actually just a newspaper report from Grantland Rice who says that there was one competitor who got taken away to have her sex checked. It was in doubt from the administrators. Now I that's all I have, so it's, anecdotal at best. But what's interesting about the 1928 Olympics is that's when women were first allowed to compete in athletics, which in the Olympics, athletics is one of the most kind of renowned. World Athletics is one of the bigger international federations. It's also a sport that many people consider masculine. So I do think there's a connection there about why those questions reached that level in 1928. But what's not in dispute is that by the 1936 Berlin Olympics, we do have competitors who are pulled aside. Helen Stevens, a U.S. track and field athlete in particular, who undergoes a physical examination. What that entails is different based on your sources, but most people suggest some sort of check on her reproductive organs.
Mm.
The World Athletics leads the way in terms of sex testing and requiring different types of examinations throughout the 30s. It's momentarily paused because of World War II. They then switched to getting certification from a doctor. So having women athletes just provide a document signed off by their physician saying that they are in fact a woman. The IOC embraces that for a little while as well, but where it becomes compulsory is in the 60s. And so in 1966, World Athletics introduces the first, and this is what's unique about it, it's the first on-site and mandatory sex test for women athletes. It has since been called the nude parade, because it was, a panel of doctors inspecting the women athletes before they competed. And I often pause and think here about, who is competing at these international events. And a lot of times we are talking about young athletes, so teenagers or athletes in their 20s, which is just another layer of why this is so awful. But athletes didn't like this, which is not surprising. And so in 1967, World Athletics turns to the bar body test. And I am a historian, so I'm not a geneticist, but what the bar body test essentially does is it tries to verify sex through chromatin, sex chromatin, so essentially chromosomes. So trying to determine whether or not athletes had the presence or absence of certain a sex chromatin to then say, are they XX or XY chromosomes? And the IOC thought that this was a good adjustment and embraced that in 1968. And so the IOC and World Athletics basically institute chromosomal controls or checks the competitors through their chromosomes from the late 60s up till 1999. And one of the things in my book that I talk about is not just the rationale for this, which did shift. Initially, sport organizers said they were looking for male imposters. They never found a single male imposter. And so then the rationale actually started to switch a little bit in the 80s to talk about, well, we're actually checking for women who have unfair physiology. So they have unfair biological advantages. And what they really start focusing on and who they're discriminating against are intersex athletes, which sport organizers now refer to athletes with DSDs or differences of sex development, but particularly individuals who sex assigned at birth is female, who identify as female, reared as women, who go to these competitions. And in the 80s, it's women who have no idea that their chromosomes or their genetic sex don't match their identity or their sex assigned at birth. Um, and so they're quietly removed from sport. There's an account from an Olympic official that this happened about 1 to 2 times every Olympics from 68 up till about 1992. So it's pretty harrowing because, again, you can't imagine. I mean, I can just not imagine the trauma of participating and practicing for a sport for 4 years to then, as I'm on this international stage, be quietly pushed and told that I need to retire. Ultimately, the World Athletics halts its compulsory testing in 1992 after athletes protested the decision, and the IOC abandoned it in 1999. But as I say in the book, in the conclusion, it actually doesn't end there. It's not as though that's the end of this story by any means. Briefly after that, both organizations embraced what they called suspicion-based testing,
This
and
sounds
that
like,
allowed
this
them.
sounds like the Clinton marriage.
Yeah, problematic on many levels.
Don't ask,
It
or
allowed them.
the Clinton marital arrangement applied to the armed services. Like don't ask, don't tell,
Oh, right.
do ask, do tell. I don't know which it is really.
Yes, right. That's this idea of, well, and it's incredibly problematic because what it basically means is that any athlete who doesn't uphold sort of global northern white femininity standards are derided, right? Their suspicion is cast on them. So it really targets strong women, women who have muscles, women of color from the global south tend to be the ones who are in the crosshairs of this quote unquote suspicion based testing. And perhaps none more so than the South African runner Caster Semenya, who was absolutely just vilified in the press in 2009 after her victory in the 800 meter. And the accusations against her are that, she's too strong, she's too fast, she's too muscular. There's one competitor who says, and this is awful, quote, just look at her. So really terrible. And in response, they suggest it's not directly related to Caster Semenya. The timing of it indicates otherwise. That World Athletics introduces a new policy in 2011, and this is the first time we have a ceiling on testosterone levels. And so they put in place, again, it's an arbitrary line in the sand about what thresholds women athletes cannot exceed. But what I find really fascinating, and I write about this in the book, is the studies they use. Not only are they flawed, I'll get to that in a moment, but it shows that there's overlap between the hormone levels of the male athletes they test and the female athletes. So there's not this clear divide between these levels. And even some of the men that they tested at these elite competitions had pretty low levels of testosterone. So It's almost like testosterone does not make an athlete the athlete. This policy is heavily disputed. It goes to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and Cass says basically that there needs to be evidence. And it doesn't exist. World Athletics hires some scientists to try to verify it. It is dubious, and this is kind of outside of where I ended. I ended my book with the introduction of the hyperandrogenism policy, the testosterone ceiling. But people have critiqued the scientific findings. There was duplications in some of the data. They had included athletes who had doped in the data set. So problematic. But that ultimately does go into effect. World Athletics continues to lower the testosterone ceiling. But, and again, this just never ends. In 2025, World Athletics has announced in March 2025 that it was going to a new form of testing, and this is the SRY gene testing, where they're looking for a specific gene on the Y chromosome of all of their athletes. And this is something that I'm now just researching because it just happened. But I will say that the individual who led the team, a geneticist who actually led the team that discovered the SRY gene, has been pretty outspoken in protesting its use in this way. And so suggesting that the SRY gene does not determine an athlete's sex, and you could again find the situation where an athlete does not realize, I don't know about you, but I've never had my chromosomes checked for an SRY gene. I don't know if I have it or don't. I can make some assumptions, but I don't know. And so for an athlete to again be preparing for competition to then be told, sorry, actually you can't compete because of this tiny little genetic marker, you're no longer allowed to participate in women's sport.
And in terms of that question you mentioned of the confusing confluence of doping and hormones, I should note that you are co-author of an article in which I have read in Frontiers in Endocrinology. I don't know how many sports historians have appeared in that journal, but you address those questions there. So, Prof, I want to take us back, as they say in baseball commentary, to a year you mentioned, 1966, when I was a child. And I remember in the run-up to the Olympics, a lot of debate about the press sisters.
Sure.
And how a lot of this turned around Sovietism and the idea of a Soviet woman as superwoman and not really female. But also 1966 is the year of Title IX being passed, I think, as part of the Education Act. No, it's not 1960.
So it's part of the Education Act. 72 is when Title IX is signed, but it's all right. It's all happening. This idea, these questions about women's rights, women's sports, absolutely.
Right. And this is, my apologies for getting the year wrong, and thank you for correcting me. This is a really important part of the federal education legislation, all of which may be disassembled if the current administration has its way, led by a magnificent former wrestler. And that is the part that basically notes that US colleges have been giving vast sums of money in subvention to male sports and not female sports, and wants to see equal treatment, right? Roughly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, this has been a bugbear for years for the right, but now they love it. Can you explain that to me?
Right. So yes, Title IX has been momentous for women's sports in the United States. Cannot be overstated how impactful. And I know I played lacrosse in college, and I am very aware that my participation hinged upon Title IX. Because as you mentioned, prior to 1972, when it was signed into effect, women's sports were not supported, were not funded, didn't have coaches. I like the example from the University of Nebraska for any followers who are women's volleyball fans, that they had a team in the 60s, but it was coached by a grad student. They didn't have uniforms, and they were in some sort of basement. So Title IX really helped provide the opportunities by requiring this equitability in different areas. And there were certain politicians, particularly in the Republican Party in the 80s, that did not like Title IX, thought that it was vague, it was excessive. Ronald Reagan actually tried to kind of derail Title IX, thinking that it was a governmental intrusion, that it was the opposite to large government, so trying to scale back government interventions. There's even a Supreme Court case that takes out actually some of the impact of Title IX. But you're right, we now see a pretty big shift about how Title IX is being viewed or deployed, you might say, in some instances. And it in particular has to do with the question of transgender athletes, so the inclusion or exclusion of trans girls and women from women's sports. And the reason there's been a shift for a lot of Republicans in thinking about Title IX, because their focus is less about the equitability. So is there funding? Are scholarships proportionate? Are participation opportunities proportionate? But instead focused very closely on the question of on the basis of sex and what that means. And so an argument is being put forward that by allowing transgender girls and women to participate in women's sport on that basis of protecting, on the basis of sex, that could be a potential Title IX violation. So it's hinging upon just a handful of words as this is working its way through the court system in the United States.
As we speak. Now, on the topic of trans athletes, this is something you've published about a lot, beginning with Renee Richards, I think, and where you've also engaged in a wonderful auto-critique, where you've found yourself guilty of cis sexism.
Yep.
So could you tell us about the story of Renee Richards? And I can also remember when she qualified for the US Open. I was a teenager, and she may have been the first. Is she a dentist? I think dentist.
Ophthalmologist.
Ophthalmologist, sorry. God, I'm really being found out today. I don't know the difference between 1966 and 1972 and the difference between eyes and teeth. But
I mean, they're close though, right? Eyes and teeth, they're all in the face, so.
They connect. Ophthalmologists, my excuse is that I've been on a liquid diet for 10 days and have 2.5 weeks to go. Is this an alibi for late in life memory loss, Prof? You're an historian.
No, I think it's
about memory.
No, you are more than okay, and the information you've been able to disseminate through this podcast has been amazing, and I commend you for being able to, I mean, speak so broadly. That's pretty impressive.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you again for correcting me. But may have been the only ophthalmologist ever to compete in the US Open. That's my quiz.
You know, I don't know about that. I can't speak to that, but I can talk a little bit about Renee Richards.
Yeah.
Both her story. I had the opportunity to interview her, which was really amazing. But then also how I've reflected upon sort of my stances or writings about trans athletes. So for any listeners who are unfamiliar, Renee Richards is a trans tennis player and one of the first out trans women to compete in women's sport. Now, I should note she was outed, which is unfortunate. She was competing in a local tournament in California. I mean, as many of us do, right? Like we not just study sport, we like to play sport. And if we can have a little competition in there, well, then even better. And so wasn't necessarily trying to make it on a national stage or wasn't trying to make any sort of stand, just was competing, but was outed by a reporter there. And so once she was outed, I mean, her name was in headlines around the world, and a lot of people asking questions that actually are pretty similar to some of those being asked today. And some of the vitriol that we're also seeing today was aimed at her in the 1970s. And so after she was outed, she did decide that she wanted to compete at a more competitive level. And so in particular, wanted to compete on the women's tour at the US Open, which a little context and may be helpful to know right now, the women's tennis was growing tremendously at the time. So the work of Billie Jean King had really spurred a lot of growth and a lot of professional opportunities. So we have the Virginia Slims Tour also taking off at this moment. And so you have some pretty awful things said about Renee Richards, saying she's just trying to capitalize on this growth, capitalize on this moment, which my read from her and meeting her is absolutely not the case. She's an athlete, and as someone who formerly could run a lot faster than I can now, I get it. I absolutely understand. You want to compete when you can. The Women's Tennis Association didn't have any sort of gender-based policy at that time. The kind of question of trans inclusion hadn't bubbled up as it has today. And so pretty quickly they meet and they decide that, well, actually we're gonna do what the IOC has done, and we're gonna use the bar body test. So we are going to, from this point forward, use the bar body test for the US Open, which the IOC had done since 1968. The WTA had it kind of at their disposal for all those years, but had never once thought it needed to or wanted to introduce that sort of sex test mechanism. So one can deduce that they pretty much did that so that Renee Richards would not pass and then would not be able to compete. Renee Richards filed a lawsuit. So pretty tremendous. Instead of kind of giving up or not competing, she filed a lawsuit, and it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, of a trans athlete filing for the right to compete. And she won her case. The judge in that case said that it would be grossly unfair to discriminate against a person just based on their chromosomes alone. So it was said by all other accounts, outside of chromosomes, Renee Richards is a woman, should be treated as such, and should be allowed to compete. The case is important when thinking about trans rights and the court system. It was certainly limited to just Renee Richards. The judge was pretty careful about not setting any sort of blanket precedent. So Renee Richards was able to compete the following year in the US Open. I do like to note, for all the people that said, oh, trans woman is going to just shellac all the competitors, it's so unfair. She lost in the first rounds, and I'm pretty sure she lost 6-1, 6-2, 6. So there was no shellacking that happened with Renee Richards. But after that, she kind of played and dabbled in tennis, different competitions, and again faced quite a bit of opposition. People were, some of her competitors, the people she played against, were pretty terrible, walking off the court or refusing to engage with her. Fortunately, and I keep thinking about this all the time, Billie Jean King actually in the trial testified on her behalf, saying she is a woman, and just like any other woman, I want to beat her. And I just really respect Billie Jean King for doing that. Interestingly, Renee Richards coached Martina Navratilova in the 80s, which is kind of a given Navratilova's current stance about trans athletes. I find that just so kind of odd that there was that relationship. But in terms of my process in writing about Renee Richards, and I share this a lot with my students, the reason I actually started writing about Renee Richards is because my initial reaction when reading, and I remember reading Susan Kahn's book, Coming on Strong, and there was a paragraph or so about Renee Richards, just that there was a trans woman who wanted to compete, filed a lawsuit, competed. And my knee-jerk reaction at that time, before I had really paused or studied or given thought to kind of some questions about gender in sport, was, well, that's not fair. And then the more I read about Renee Richards, the more I read about kind of how we conceptualize sport, what does fairness even mean? Now I realize how wrong that stance is, just the automatic assumption that any person whose sex assigned at birth is male is automatically going to be better than any person whose sex assigned at birth is female. And I share that to note that we can, we're always learning, we're always getting better, hopefully we're always evolving. But I think it helps students too as they're navigating some of these current questions about trans athletes, because it's been really politicized and there's a tremendous amount of misinformation. But if we can remember one thing with Renee Richards and trans athletes now is, there are people who want to play sport. And so if we can just stick with that, then I think we'd have a much better, I don't know, future about what this might all look like. I don't have high hopes at the moment, but if we can all remember the humanity in people, then maybe we'll get there.
I note that it feels like it's almost every few weeks, certainly every few months, that World Athletics, I think still led by the monstrous Seb Coe, World Cycling, World Swimming, they change their policies on this all the time.
Hmm.
People like Coe claim that this is about evolving science, but it's obviously cherry picking very incomplete knowledge. And the prof's nodding her head at the moment as the resident endocrinologist in the episode of the podcast. But they cherry pick, they change position. Some of it seems to be about political pressure
Hmm.
by various capital P party political forces. But there's also a feminist opposition to trans women athletes. And this seems to be very strong. Some of it seems to be animated in part by evangelical Christianity, and some of it seems to be compelled, dynamized, at least in part, by the sense of unfairness that you spoke about a moment ago when you read Susan Kahn's pioneering book.
Hmm.
Could you tell us a bit about the split within feminism, which is not only happening in sports, it's happening more generally about things like access to restrooms, but
Sure.
all sorts of other topics too, where this is a very live issue and where people who would regard themselves otherwise as progressive, in inverted commas, are
Hmm.
absolutely not on this topic.
Right. And this is obviously a controversial topic and politicized question. And it's been, I suppose not interesting is not the right word, but it's been harrowing to watch, I suppose I will say, to see this split in how people view trans women in particular. And so you do have a group of individuals who argue that the inclusion is unfair and prioritize physiological fairness, I would say. That's how I have sort of viewed their takeaways, that they're talking about what I view as cherry-picked science, um, to make the claim that trans girls and women are going to have a physiological unfairness.
Hmm.
The the quote unquote science doesn't really exist or doesn't necessarily back up that point. Um, I think it's always really helpful when having this conversation to remember two stats I always come back to, and this is what I encourage my students to think about. And the first is there is some studies that suggest that about 80% of people, and I believe this was in the United States, but maybe we can extrapolate, have kind of met or interacted with an out trans person. So I think there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of unknown, and there's a lot of misinformation. Because when I ask my students, okay, this is a big topic in the news. How many trans athletes are there? How many, trans athletes does this group of feminists say need to be kept out of sport? And they assume it's huge. They assume that there's just hundreds of trans athletes who want to compete, in youth sport, who want to compete in the NCAA, and who want to compete in the Olympics. And then when you actually look, and I have them look at some stats from the states where I've been, Virginia or North Carolina, it's about 0.05% of the athletes. And then if you look at the NCAA, the data that they put forward before they updated to ban trans athletes, it was, I think, over a 10-year period from 2010 to 2022, roughly about 60 out athletes. When you're talking about the hundreds of thousands of NCAA athletes, it's a pretty small number. And then the same holds true for at the international level. And so I bring up that point about 80% because I just think we lose sight that these are real people, real humans, not frauds who are trying to invade the space of women's sports. I think that a lot of people who support trans athletes in women's sports, or trans men in men's sports, but support trans inclusion for us the question of sport participation is less on medals and money, but really about the benefits of sport.
Mm.
The things we all say when we're teaching about sport that, well, why we do this? Why do we have young kids participate in sport? Why do we celebrate Olympians? It's for all the other reasons, the camaraderie, the self-esteem. And so I'm always really concerned that so much of the conversation focuses on a handful of really elite athletes who are vying for, let's say, NCAA records or who are trying to compete in the Olympics, with the real harm that's being done on trans kids in particular, who perhaps would benefit the most from some of the um, positive attributes of sport. And if we want to talk about actual issues and if we want to talk about protecting women's sport, then I would think that we should maybe be thinking about things like trying to combat sexual abuse in sport, which affects a lot more people than trans athletes. Or let's talk about funding. Let's talk about media coverage. Um, so
That,
I just, yeah, there's
that's
a lot of just
wonderful.
misinformation and shaping of the
Yeah,
conversation.
actually, you've just raised two of the issues I wanted to mention to you next. Um, Sexual abuse in sports and bourgeois media's coverage, both of
Mm-hmm.
which you've published on, and longitudinally in a way in terms of the Olympics and press coverage. Could we start with the sexual abuse in sport issue? This is absolutely huge. It's always been huge. It'll always be huge because of the operation of hegemonic masculinity.
Yeah.
This is not something that Ms. McMahon and Mr. Trump are showing great anxiety about.
Right, right. This is something that affects a lot more athletes. I've written a bit about sexual abuse in sport. I had the opportunity with a collaborator, York Krieger, who led that project, but was particularly interested in some of these lawsuits that athletes have filed against whether it's national governing bodies or in our instance, we were looking at the US, so the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, um, following the introduction of the Center for Safe Sport. And so after the USA gymnastics scandal brought a lot of this to attention, there were efforts to reform and to try to dismantle some of the structures that led to the cover-ups, led to athletes being kind of either quietly pushed aside or sent to, in this instance, different gyms to work with young athletes. But unfortunately, given the very structure of sport, this is an instance where we just see history continue to repeat itself. There's power dynamics, obviously, between athletes and coaches. And so we see a lot of male coaches in positions of power over young girls, but it also is over young boys as well. And then the success that sometimes these coaches have provides a shield for them. And so, unfortunately, I think for me, what that research showed was how widespread the problem is. It's easy to point to USA Gymnastics and say, well, they failed all their athletes. But this research in particular showed that it was many national governing bodies. And then there's the themes in these lawsuits that kept coming up about the power dynamics, the cover ups, the not believing athletes. I appreciate that there have been steps to attempt to mitigate some of this, but I suspect it's not going to be long before there's just another. I mean, it keeps happening. There's these details come forward about not just that there's abuse, but that people knew about it and were involved in a cover up.
It's the papacy playbook. It's lots and lots of religious organizations behaving like this, and lots of sports organizations and schools, and often one suspects parents turning the proverbial blind eye because of, and this is one of the crucial elements of the incredible violence of sports, vicarious pleasure that
Yeah.
is given to parents through their children's participation in sports. And this being something they'll do at all costs. And in the US, the flip side to the good aspects of Title IX is pushing for their children to do well at sports to get a free ride in college. And that's a hidden aspect of this, I think.
Absolutely. It's forthcoming, but I'm working on something that actually looks at the testimony at the Larry Nasser, who was, found guilty of hundreds of accounts of assaults for USA Gymnastics, but some of the parent testimony, and it's harrowing because they say, I didn't believe my child. I didn't believe. I was told that it was all part of what was to be expected by people within the gymnastic structure. And so you have this harm being caused by the culprit, by the sport leaders who are covering it up, and then parents who want their children to be successful in sport and so will do anything it takes.
I had an experience of this as a teenager in fencing, but this was before the coining of the term sexual harassment, which I think first appears in the New York Times in 1980. And in that case, my parents were not to blame. I had no language to describe what was being done to me, and not only to me. But since that time, the people involved in that have, you know, either killed themselves or gone to jail. And many other people suffered much more than I did. But it's interesting when there is this question of, do you have a way of communicating what's going on? You might be able to describe certain actions to your fellow pupils and say that was disgusting, but you can't systematize it. Anyway, my exciting autobiography aside, Prof, can I ask you now about these studies you've done for the Women's Foundation in Sport, I think it's called.
Mm-hmm.
You've done for at least 2 Olympics. I've read the 2016 and 2020 reports. I don't know whether you've done one for 2024 or not, but you have. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. It was a little slower to be released, but yes, the 2024 Paris report is out.
Oh gosh. So
No,
bad.
it was late. It was very late to be disseminated. So,
It's absolutely not my fault. Just like saying
that's right.
just was a dentist and Title IX was passed in 1966. I am absolved of all blame here.
I I think so. Yes.
So over that, I suppose then it's 3 Olympics that you've done the studies for, or
Oh
was there
gosh,
an
I
earlier one?
started it. I think I started in 2016. I think I was brought on first for the Rio
Right.
Olympics.
So the ones I've read that you did were 2016 and 2020, and they do look backwards to see whether there's been an improvement. Can you
Hmm.
spill the beans a bit on the 2024 report, which I'm quickly going to look for while you answer?
Sure. No, yeah, right. So I do some work for the Women's Sport Foundation with some amazing colleagues, Amy Bass, Maureen Smith, and Emily Houghton, and we look at the participation trends, media representation, and leadership from a gender equity standpoint. And I believe the report started in 2008, but as I said, I was brought in 2016. And we are actually currently collecting data right now. So maybe this is another thing that's preoccupying me for the 2022 Winter Olympics. But the big takeaway, I suppose, from all the reports is always that women tend to be underrepresented. Now, it used to be as athletes, as leaders, and in media representation, but there has been some great work made to have parity in athletic participation opportunities. And so there is certainly a celebration to be had about 2024 with the Paris Olympics because there was an effort to have equal participation and equitable number of men and women, which is a milestone to record. However, one of the things that we noted in our report is that maybe this comes with a bit of an asterisk. There was still inequitability in some of the events. So, what women can compete in, or the distances that they're able to cover in some of their races. The numbers also didn't line up entirely. So, there were more male wrestlers, but more female swimmers, or in gymnastics, for example. There were also some countries in 2024 where women were pretty severely underrepresented or not included. So, absolutely tremendous milestone, and important that the IOC is recognizing and striving for, at least in the Summer Olympics, parity with athletes. Our initial data collection suggests that that's absolutely not going to be true for the 2022 Winter Olympics, the upcoming report that we're working on right now. And what we're particularly concerned about this go round with participation is there's some sort of baked in inequities. Just the example that we're highlighting right now is that there's 12 men's hockey teams with a larger roster and then only 10 women's hockey teams with a smaller roster. So the structure itself sometimes lends itself to inequities. I particularly, for the reports, focused on the leadership angles, and there's also been progress. The IOC executive board is striving for or increasing every time I do the report that they're going to have male and female representation. There's for the first time now a female IOC president. So again, that's huge. We don't see parity trickle down to other levels. So most of the international federations still headed by men. Most of their executive boards are still pretty male dominated. But if I had one takeaway about the most severe underrepresentation, and this has held true from 2016 up through now, whether it's summer or winter Olympics, and that's in coaches. So women are still severely underrepresented as coaches. I think I'd have to go back to look at the last report, but it was around 13% of US coaches in 2024 were women. And so we're not seeing quite as much strides being made in that realm as some of the others.
As I recall, after Title IX was enacted, more men got involved in coaching women's sports in college than had been the case before. And
That's correct. Yes.
for those aware of this, NCAA means National Collegiate Athletic Association. And if you look at public sector salaries in the United States, in all Republican states and many Democrat ones, the highest paid civil servants are college coaches of men's football and basketball teams. They can
Yes,
earn three
correct.
times what college presidents do. They can earn more than the president of the United States does. That's in his legit formal economy income. And this does not apply to women's sports. This
No,
massive
right.
disparity between ordinary public sector workers,
Hmm.
people working at, let's say the University of Illinois or, Michigan
Right.
State.
Right.
Prof, I had one last question for you, if I may, and then I'd like, once you've answered, to give you the opportunity to raise anything else you might wish to that either covers terrain we've already looked at or is totally new. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a close?
That sounds great.
So my last question is about a piece that a couple of you or three of you wrote on the IOC presidency, which I would summarize as two cheers for Kirsty.
Yes.
She seems like a completely reactionary choice to me, but she's the first woman to have this position. You know much more about it than I do. What's the scoop?
What's the scoop? Sure. Yeah. So we did write a piece. It was my colleague Yor Krieger again and Jamie Schultz. And what we were intending to do is we did want to recognize that it is a momentous feat, that there had not been a woman as IOC president in its history, which when you think about the IOC first forming in 1894, it was all wealthy men and women weren't even included until 1981 to the IOC as members. That this is an accomplishment. This is certainly something to note. We want to celebrate. Our concern, though, is that we hope it doesn't halt progress in other areas. Because while it is important that there is a woman that is leading the IOC, there's still quite a bit of work to do in other areas. So whether that's within the IOC structure itself as the members or within the National Olympic committees, which are still dominated by men, that we hope to recognize and celebrate, but also that this isn't going to just mask some of the other inequalities that still persist. And Um, Coventry has, I'll be curious to see how she responds to some of these questions about women's sport, both in terms of, let's say, promotion, something that's maybe not as controversial, but also about sex testing or trans athletes. So I guess our hesitation to full-throated celebration is there's still a lot of issues at play, and we'll be curious to see how she leads.
Thanks so much, Prof. And as I said, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything. It might be something that I haven't asked you about, like women in baseball, you've published on, or it might be something that adds to what we've already chatted about.
Whew. Gosh, well, I guess since you mentioned it, I don't know if I'm creative enough to think off the top of my head. I did write a piece about women in baseball, uh, which is a bit maybe lighter too than some of the other topics that I've discussed. I really enjoyed writing that piece
Uh-huh.
because it was sort of a one-off, something I don't usually do. And also some of the stories you can read about when you're researching sex testing are harrowing and can be hard to kind of assess or analyze or read through. But so the women in baseball, basically it was just to celebrate women's suffrage and the right to vote. It was actually a solicited piece where the journal wanted to include something about sport and suffrage, and so it let me kind of run with it. And it was really fascinating because it was a bit out of my wheelhouse. And basically, what I found is that suffragettes used baseball as a means to promote the right for women to vote. And so, whether that was through the sport itself, so this idea of the physical is political, or through actual just promotions at baseball games, it became a vehicle to express and fight for women's rights. So, to use the spectacle, because baseball was a very popular sport in the US at that time, still is, but was very popular. And so, to utilize that in a way to encourage people to support women's right to vote was a fun piece to write, and definitely kind of a different avenue for me to explore than I usually do.
And a terrific piece it is.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much, Prof. Parks Piper. It's been lovely chatting to you. As I say to many of my guests, I've learned a lot from reading your work and even more from talking to you today.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. It's been really nice to chat with you.